Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, it's a big honor for me to have C. Daniel Batson on the podcast. Dan is a social psychologist and Emeritus Professor at the University of Kansas. He has 2 PhDs, one in theology and one in psychology, both from Princeton University. And in his long career, his research has focused on altruism, empathic concern, psychology of religion, and many other topics. As I mentioned in the conversation, I recall reading Dan's papers in grad school, learned much about the empathy-altruism hypothesis. He is a giant in this world, and so it was a big honor for him to come on and talk about it. We discuss the empathy-altruism hypothesis. We talk about some of the differences and similarities that he has with Paul Bloom's work on empathy. We talk about empathic concern, why he emphasizes that, egoistic and altruistic motives, cooperation, what the future of altruism empathy research looks like, and many other topics. This is an area that continues to be explored and people continue to research and publish on. I can think of many people, McCullough, Nicola Rehani, many, obviously Paul Bloom. Many people are doing research and writing on empathy, on cooperation. And so we're trying to really figure out, as humans, how we can be really nice to each other and how we can be terrible with each other. And, Dan's work is, he was a trendsetter in a lot of this research, and he's still doing research in this area. And so it's nice to hear his thoughts, how it's evolved, where it's going. His work is very invaluable. So, of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share, contribute. All of that is much appreciated. And now I bring you C. Daniel Batson. I am here with the one and only Daniel Batson. Dan, thanks so much for taking your time to come on the podcast and talk to us about a handful of topics. I'm real appreciative of that.
Well, it's good to be here.
I've followed your work and your research for a long time. I've read your papers in grad school, and so it's a big honor. We talk about a lot of your work and a lot of fun and interesting topics. Before we do, why don't you just tell listeners kind of a snapshot of just who you are professionally, academically, and anything you're still currently working on?
Well, I guess most salient is I'm old. I'm retired and am no longer doing research, which I did for quite a while. As far as sort of summary of where I was academically, I was an undergraduate psych major, but I went to seminary intending to be a Presbyterian minister and did that degree and actually got ordained, although they invited me a few years ago to request that I be relieved of the duties of ordination, was the terminology. Yeah.
Really? Interesting.
So I said, that's fine, and I never heard from him again, so I don't think I'm ordained anymore.
Interesting.
But after seminary, I did a graduate degree, a doctorate at the seminary, actually, sort of in interdisciplinary studies. And then I did a doctorate in psychology at Princeton University. And so that gave me the research focus that I've used all my career. I then went to the University of Kansas, where I taught until I retired.
Wow. So you've lived 2 lives of sorts, I guess. You've done the kind of more religious thing, and then you've done the more, the research psychology thing. You've kind of been in 2 worlds.
Yep, that's true.
Yeah. Interesting. It's sort of similar. I haven't done it as long as you have, but
Good for
I
you.
I also went to a seminary,
Ah,
and it was a seminary down here. It was a theological seminary,
yeah.
and
In what was the?
it was called Capital Bible Seminary at the time.
Oh,
People
okay.
used to call it, Dallas Theological on the East
Okay.
Coast. Yeah.
I remember being aware of Dallas Theological, I think.
Very, very similar kind of tradition.
Yeah.
And and then when I finished, I wanted to do clinical psych, and then got the doctorate in clinical psych, and clinical psychologist now, and so. But yeah, I'm sympathetic to that kind of that arc of sorts of starting out religious, doing some of the study there, and then turning to psychology. So I'm sympathetic.
Okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah. So you are most known for the empathy-altruism hypothesis. That is your kind of claim to fame. And so,
Well, I don't claim that it's original with me, though.
sure, fair enough, fair enough. But you usually are the one that is your papers and your work are
I put
usually
that label
associated.
on it. I think
Yeah.
I plead guilty to that.
Why don't you just kind of tell us the overview, kind of from how you understood it at the time, how you came to kind of working with that, and then many years later, how do you feel it holds, and how do you think it's still built upon now? You kind of just give us that summary of the theory.
Well, what I meant by the empathy altruism hypothesis was just that empathy produces altruism. But the problem is that empathy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and so does altruism. So you have to be more specific than that. And so an slightly elaborated version is empathic concern, that is, concern for the welfare of another, which is only one notion of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually not the one that's most common now. Right now, feeling as another person feels is likely to be called empathy, or taking the perspective of another person is likely to be called empathy, and have been for a long time. But there also has been, for a long time, the tradition, actually, uh, in counseling clinical traditions, of empathic concern, where you feel concern for the welfare of another.
Mm.
And that's what I mean by empathic concern, a feeling for, that is, if we get more detailed about it, it's elicited by and congruent with the perceived welfare of the person in need, since we're talking about concern here.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what I'm talking about. That I think produces an altruistic motivation. And so a lot of people, when they talk about altruism, they talk about behavior, and that's not the behavior I would call helping, or there are a variety of other things you could do. But I'm interested in the link between this emotional state of empathic concern, feeling for another, and a motive, a desire to increase the welfare of the other. And if the person's in need, why then it's to alleviate the need. But that motive doesn't necessarily lead you to help in certain circumstances. Somebody else may be better qualified to help. You may want them to do it. You may have other demands that don't allow you to act on that, but it's the motive that is the concern. And that's what makes it a challenging research problem, because these are two internal states we're talking about. And you have to infer those states, and I think we do it all the time. We infer states in another, but you have to infer those states from a pattern of behavior. And I don't think you can trust self-reports on this kind of stuff, because both the empathic concern and the altruistic motivation are, socially desirable characteristics, things that a lot of people would like to think that they have and feel and do. And so it's looking at a pattern of behavior across varying circumstances that you use to infer the nature of the motive. And so and really experiments, as far as I know, to do, that requires using an experimental method. I don't think correlational studies will do it. And so, I don't know, where should we go from there?
Well, there's plenty of places. So sort of take them separate here. I guess with empathy, I'll come to altruism in a minute because there's some interesting components to that as well. I guess empathy is interesting because, so you'll hear people colloquially kind of say like, need to have an empathic way or have a spirit of empathy or people will kind of use it as a catchphrase, practice empathy and stuff.
Right.
But it seems to be a bit complicated. So I'll bring it up here at the beginning since we're talking about empathy, which is a little bit different from altruism. I'm sure you're familiar.
It's not just a little bit different. I think it's a big difference.
Yeah. Well, it's good because it's good to tease out one before and then see the linkage. But I'm sure you've heard of, Paul Bloom and his work on empathy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think it's his breakdown per se, but he has a breakdown of, which I think has been established in the literature of, there are different types of empathy. So you can have a kind of affective empathy, a cognitive empathy, and then I think he places more emphasis on compassion in terms of making moral decisions or certain decisions.
For him, compassion is sort of a principled view that you should care, you ought to care about the welfare of others. So it's more a moral motive, really,
right,
than an altruistic one. I would say, but
yeah. So, how do you see the breakdown with how empathy works? Do you like that affective or quasi-emotive cognitive empathy?
I think the general strategy of it's sort of like getting back to faculty psychology, where you've got there's thoughts, feelings, will, those kinds of things, something like that. Right. And I don't think that helps because there are affective and cognitive components to empathic concern. I mean, there has to be awareness of the need, all sorts of things. But it is an emotional state, I would say. But emotions involve cognition.
Sure.
So I don't think that's a useful carving of things. There is a very common distinction, as I mentioned earlier, I think, between feeling for the person, which is what I'm talking about as empathy or empathic concern, and feeling as another person feels. And that's Paul's definition. Right. If you look at the first chapter of his book, it's very clear that's what he's talking about. Now, when he goes on in the book, later on, and particularly talking about clinical situations and things like that, he's talking more about feeling for in his examples that he uses and cases that he talks about. But his definition is feeling as, and that's not what I'm talking about.
What do you think is the distinct or big importance here with empathic concern and I guess in how you're framing it? Because I think sometimes this is sort of getting into motive, but do you need to feel or should you feel or however you want to phrase it exactly what somebody's feeling to impart some kind of connection or some kind of well-being, or can you cognitively say that? Yeah, you could cognitively say, wow, that must be really tough. Wow, that's really hard. You had a loss. You had something bad happen or something's really difficult.
Yeah, but you don't need to like that person feels.
Right.
I mean,
have to feel it.
I think it is possible to feel as another person feels. But it has nothing to do necessarily with what I'm calling empathic concern. It could be a stepping stone under certain circumstances, but I mean, think about two fans at a basketball game who watch their team lose.
Mm-hmm.
They're sitting on opposite sides of this arena or something, and they're both feeling very sad. So they're feeling as the other person feels.
Mm.
Is that empathic concern? No way. They don't even know about the other person.
Mm. So when the Kansas basketball team, when they lose, and those fans,
yes, which they did just recently.
Yes. Right. They're feeling terrible. They're feeling terrible. But you can have some kind of commiserate kind of like, oh, I know what it's. I know what that feeling is or whatever. But yeah, I guess.
Well, even something that you don't know in one sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can feel a woman in childbirth screaming.
Yeah.
Not a state I've experienced, nor am I likely to experience. But it requires some imagination.
Mm-hmm.
But most fiction writers will say that's the whole point, that you don't have to experience what you're talking about. You have to, understand it. That's the challenge.
Mm. So I guess, so just so I'm clear here, the distinction is you're not necessarily crazy about the terms affective or cognitive, because most people know that there is thinking and feeling of sorts. There's an integration there, but it's more of the feeling towards or the feeling with kind of thing, right? But it's a better distinction with concern.
Well, feeling for is what I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and that requires that you think you understand the other person's situation. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's one thing to point out, is that by my definition, you could totally misunderstand that the person's in need. If you think they're in need, you can feel empathic concern as I'm talking about it, but it's just misguided.
So there's a sort of interpretive or perceptual difference here sometimes with this. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, it is the perception of the person who's feeling the empathic concern that's at issue. And if they're wrong about what's going on, and we're often wrong about what either we or other people need, but we can feel for them, and they may get really mad because they feel like we're totally misunderstanding, which we can be. But that doesn't mean it's not empathic concern. I guess one thing to emphasize, both for empathy and for altruism, as I talk about them, is they're not just all good. There are negative consequences to each, as well as positive consequences.
Sure.
And it seems to me, as a psychologist, the crucial thing is to be able to identify the dynamic that underlies this, so that you can know when it's going to be useful and when it's not.
Trying to think of an example. I totally agree with you on that. Is there an example you can kind of just pull from on the negative side of it? Because I think you're right. I think that's absolutely right.
The negative side? Well, parents can often, something happens to their child and they're totally distraught and convinced that the child is in great need, and it may not be the case. And so that's sort of a helicopter parent is kind of an example of that kind of imposing your perception of what's needed in the situation.
What do you make of the piece of, compassion? People make this distinction. There's this strange thing psychologists do all the time where we just start calling the same underlying construct by all these different terms, and we repackage it a certain way, and we're really just talking about the same thing. Is that what this feels here, or is it an overlap? How do you see this?
Well, I think what Paul's talking about, what he calls rational compassion, is different from what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I think there is a real difference there. Okay. But at the same time, I don't make a distinction. I don't make a distinction between compassion. It's one example of what I'm calling empathic concern.
Okay.
But the reason that I don't make the distinction is because my and colleagues' research participants don't make a distinction. Those terms correlate highly. And so I consider how a person wants to talk about this other-oriented feeling for state. It can be compassion, it can be sympathy, it can be empathy, although one of the things we found out early on is that most of our research participants didn't know what empathy meant. That is, they would often leave that item on a feelings questionnaire that they were checking, indicating what they were feeling in a situation. They would just leave it blank or put a question mark or something like that. And so, and when we explained to them what we were talking about, they would often say, "Oh, you mean sympathy," and that's fine. I mean, so I've tried to work with what they give us as far as the way they're thinking about this. Now, in other languages, things are a bit different. Sympathy can mean something like simpatico is not the same as what I'm talking about as a feeling for. It's kind of feeling along with. So I don't make a distinction there. I guess warm, soft-hearted, tender, moved, sympathetic, and compassionate are the 6 adjectives that we've found tend to best indicate on self-report measures when you're responding to a person in need, best indicate what I'm talking about as empathic concern. And I should say, this empathic concern I'm talking about is an emotion in a situation. It's not a general dispositional quality. There are people like Mark Davis has developed an instrument to measure empathic concern, self-reports of a sort of disposition to feel empathic concern. I'm skeptical about those kinds of measures because, again, they're self-reports. And sure, a lot of people would like to think that they're sympathetic and compassionate, and they may be, but they may not.
Right, that's right. You would agree that some of the darker sides, I guess, of empathy, I mean, I think Paul talks about this, is this idea of the spotlight effect. It shows our stereotypes, our biases. We're going to be empathic for people we like or we kind of care about more, things like, you would agree on that line?
Oh, yeah, and I should point out that the research he cites in support of that is our research. That is my colleagues and mine. So I hardly would disagree with that.
Right.
I think he's very insightful there.
So we're kind of getting around it here. It seems that when you're trying to, I mean, this is what good researchers will do, is you're trying to understand, especially because self-report measures are so terrible in a lot of ways, statistically and things like that. But they're useful. But we're trying to understand.
Unfortunately, they're the only thing we've got on.
That's right. It's the only thing we got.
Emotions. I mean, they're not the only thing. There also are some physiological, particularly neurophysiological attempts now, and eventually I hope that will be a better way to be able to go, but we're not there yet with that. It's not there.
We're trying to get at what the person, the individual's, at the very least, subjective or internal experience is. And that's why the naming of this is the terms is kind of the descriptors you use, the adjectives you used. So this is a question I have, which will tie into altruism, but is what we're really concerned about or what we're really interested in is less so of, I guess, the feeling and or the morals around it or the values, but more of the intention. The intention is critical here, right? Like, isn't that the important thing for understanding
on a motive? I mean, what I'm talking about when I talk about altruism as a motive, I'm talking about a goal-directed motive. So there is something you're trying to achieve. And in the case of an altruistic motive, motivational state with the ultimate goal, that is, we can have instrumental goals of a motive as well as what I would call an ultimate goal, which is what you're really after in the situation. Or one of the things, because you can have multiple ultimate goals. But again, the motive is situational. In this situation, is increasing the other's welfare an ultimate goal? That is something that you're trying to achieve. And that sort of loops back to the beginning of this process, which is, when do you feel empathic concern? And you have to, I think, care about the welfare of the other. That is, you have to value the other's welfare. If you don't value the other's welfare, you can perceive them to be in need, and you just don't give a shit.
So the empathy is the critical ingredient for having goal-directed behavior or motivation.
Well,
that
I'm
is altruistic.
saying it elicits a goal-directed motive, which is the altruistic motive.
Uh-huh.
Now, there could be other sources of that unaltruistic motive, and certainly people have proposed others. There's not good evidence, as far as I know, for others, not because they don't exist, but because the research hasn't been done.
Okay.
But so the caring about the welfare of the other is sort of a necessary precondition. The other is perceiving the other in need. I mean, you can care about the other's welfare, and if you don't perceive them in need, you're not going to feel empathic concern. There's no reason.
So it's like a two-pronged thing. It's you care about the welfare of someone else, and you perceive it in a particular way.
Perceive them to be in need in this situation. Put those two things together, and then you're going to have this feeling for congruent emotional state with the goal that elicits the goal of increasing the other's welfare, that is, removing the need. So it just works.
Now, is this, you're saying that this is situationally based, and so this doesn't scale, or does it? I mean, it doesn't scale upwards, right? So like you can feel, the example that people use is like, there's somebody in a pond and they're drowning, and you're like, right. I care, like they're in need, I care for them, I perceive they're in need, I'm going to go help them. And so then they go and they help them, and whatever. But that's one person in a situation. You're not going to necessarily feel for a village of starving, people. I have so much empathy for them and they're in need. I mean, you might, but it doesn't scale up because you as an individual can't do anything. How does the scalability of this construct?
Well, yeah, I mean, the emotion I'm talking about, I think, is based in responding to the need of an individual. But we've actually done some research, colleagues again, and on under what conditions does feeling for a member of a stigmatized group, say, increase your attitudes, improve your attitudes towards the stigmatized group? That is, can it affect a reaction to the group as a whole, or to individuals in the group other than the person for whom you felt the empathy? And that is possible. The conditions for it to occur seem to be that you need to be well aware of the group membership of the person. And so they're not, one of the problems that you can get is a subtyping, where you say, okay, this is the exception that proves the rule, kind of. Yeah, I care about this Black man, but I know him, he's special, and it doesn't generalize. And that's a possible result for somebody who is, has negative attitude towards Blacks, but then has this experience, then you get, that's not going to go very far. But if the membership is clear, and the others are perceived to be in similar need situations, then you can get effects that are much broader. So,
Is there when you kind of put this at the group level, can you also have the kind of push this forward on the extreme end of things where you're having pity for a group or individuals in a group, or you're overly victimizing them all the time, or always saying, can you push the other way on this too?
oh, I mean, yeah, you can certainly. Well, I guess we need to make the distinction between a sort of just feeling, and if it's for a group, particularly a group where there's nothing you can do, it's pretty cheap to oh, I feel just awful about that. I'm just so sorry. See you later.
Right.
And so, simply because you feel doesn't mean anything's going to happen. And that's one of the reasons for doing the research, to try to figure out under what conditions does it evoke an effective motive and not.
In terms of altruism, I mean, do you believe in this kind of pure altruism? I feel like it's the person.
What do you mean by pure altruism?
Yeah, so like I feel like the person giving the empathic concern for doing something good for someone, or doing something altruistically, it always feels like there's a selfish component to it. Like you're always getting something out of it, right?
Well, it gets complicated because yes, it does. And first, you have to. I think it's worth pointing out that to have an altruistic motive and to act on that motive, and to succeed in making the other person feel better or enabling them to feel better, you're going to feel better too. I mean, I would suspect the motive of a person who, having done that, doesn't feel better, because it suggests they don't really care about the person. And so it's not that there could be self-benefit. It's a question of whether those benefits are the goal.
Okay.
If that's what you're after, then that's an egoistic motive, a self-interested motive. If it's a consequence of you attaining the goal of an altruistic motive, the motive's still altruistic. There was I guess there was a New Yorker cartoon decades ago where a kid was reaching down, and there was this guy lying on the sidewalk, and the child has apparently asked if he's all right, and the guy says, "You're the only one who stopped. Here's $5,000." And does that change the motivation of the child in the situation? No. So you have to distinguish between, again, the intent, as you mentioned, what you're after, what the goal is, and the consequence. But that complicates the issue. The fact that if you benefit somebody else in need, both you and the other person are going to benefit. I mean, if you help them, they feel better, you feel better. And so what I've done in research, colleagues and I have done, is to try to think about what are the possible self-benefits that could occur in this situation, or in general, what are the self-benefits that a person might get by acting on an empathically induced motive to benefit another. that is under the conditions of empathy, and it leads to increased helping, things like that. How do we know that that helping is directed towards the benefit of the other, or ultimately toward a self-benefit? And that's where experiments come in.
Yeah, it's interesting because intention, motives, and behavior are all critical here. And I guess it does become important. I mean, I guess you can have both. I mean, two things can be true at the same time, obviously, or multiple things can be true. But, for example, like if I only help people of a group, or if I only help, men that can, compensate me, or they're going to give me some status, or they're going to give me some kind of kickback, if you will, of sorts, whatever that looks like, then, and I'm not just doing it because I'm being a good person or being a good neighbor helping them, then wouldn't most people view that behavior as not as pro-social as it is? You're only doing it for your benefit. This is that egoistic motive.
Well, again, the behavior, I would say, the pro-socialness of the behavior is the consequences for the other. But as far as the motive, that's a self-interested motive. If what you're after is getting the stroke from other people or feeling good about yourself, and those are the kinds of alternative motives that we have tried to test. Is that what's going on? Because you can think about a situation where, well, if that's what's going on, then a person who feels empathy, and these are empathy-induced motives that we're talking about now. We're not talking about just everything, because clearly we often do that. Mm-hmm. But does empathy lead to a motive that maybe I'm more likely, I feel better when a person for whom I feel empathy thanks me or something, so it's an empathy-specific reward that I get. And you can set up experiments where you can tease apart whether that's what's going on or an altruistic motive. And that's what we've done.
On the social front, though, it just feels like in society we judge people if they have an egoistic motive. And I guess the question I have is so what? If you're caring for someone, you feel for others, and you're doing something good for them, objectively and or subjectively, and you also get something out of it, does it really matter?
Well, I think it does under certain circumstances. I mean, if what I'm after is those strokes,
right?
Then if I've got a situation where I could benefit somebody, but for one reason or another, I know I'm not going to get the stroke, then I don't do it. Because I don't reach my goal then. Mm. If it's true that my instrumental act of benefiting the other is an instrumental, I'm reaching an instrumental goal on the way to the ultimate goal, which is to get stroke, then if I'm not going to get the stroke, forget about it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to do the other. And so that's why you have to try to tease these things apart. It's a question of where it will generalize and when. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah, I totally get. If somebody's doing it with a sort of dishonest motive, let's say they want to get the praise or the status or whatever, and then they end up not getting it, and then they just don't do it or don't follow through. I mean, I could see the judgment or condemnation people would give. But if both things are happening, does it matter? Like if you sincerely are motivated for the other person and you also do get something from it, I mean, I think both things can happen.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and that's fine. You can have both egoistic and altruistic motives at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's no problem.
Okay.
The question is, are we ever motivated? I mean, to some degree, the philosophical tradition and psychological too, and the culture in general has made the problem for me a lot easier if I'm trying to argue that there are altruistic motives, is to, all I have to do is show that there is an altruistic motive. I don't show that I'm certainly not claiming that it's the only motive out there.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be.
Well, this is a good point that you're bringing up. I mean, is that we have multiple motives, which, again, is tough, right? Because, we'll bring religion into this. If I'm doing something, make it easier. If I'm only doing something because a book tells me to, a deity tells me to, a tradition tells me to, and it's legitimately the person believes that it's for the better of somebody else, but only because you're following or doing something, doesn't it, for some people, kind of diminish that a little bit? Because it's not really from you. You're doing it because you're being told to, or you perceive that that's what you're being told to do. So that's why you're doing it. You could say many missionaries do this. They go around the world and they do all these things because they have all these things, but it's not maybe entirely because they care about doing it. I mean, maybe they do, but if it did not say go into all the world and preach it, they probably wouldn't do it. Really, they wouldn't be motivated to do it. It wouldn't be a approximate motivation. You could claim that. Does that matter?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say that's not an altruistic motive necessarily, but it still can lead to good things.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, I mean, if what you're trying to do is give credit, sort of say, altruism gets 10 points, egoism gets 0, or egoism gets -10, something like that.
Right.
That kind of concern plays into it. I'm not trying to judge the goodness or badness of the motives. I'm trying to look at the way the motives function in the life of individuals. And under certain circumstances, they seem to produce things that I and maybe others think is good. But that's a separate issue.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, here's another thing that I'm thinking of. If I do something, let's say, nice for someone, and I legitimately, because I just think humans are terribly complicated with this. If I do something nice for somebody, I say, you know what? Don't worry about it. I'm gonna pay for lunch today, Dan. Don't worry about it. I feel it. I feel. He's going through a tough time. You know what? I got lunch. Don't worry about it. Don't even worry. I'll pay for it. And I genuinely feel that. And yeah, maybe I'll get the nice warm and fuzzies that I did something nice for you, and and maybe you say thanks. I'm so appreciative, or whatever. But let's say we're at a conference. And you're doing well, and you've written another book, and you got your royalties check and the whole thing, and we go out to
45 cents. We're gonna have
right. We go out to lunch, and I said, well, and there's a moment, and there's this long-term expectation that, well, now you're gonna do me. I paid it forward. You're gonna do me a solid now because I helped you out. But see, if I'm thinking that in the moment, in the first occasion, I mean, is that not like a shitty thing to do? Because it's like, well, yeah, I'm doing this for you, but I'm expecting you to like pull your weight later, man. Like, and I just don't feel like that's. Look, maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe it does, because then you're gonna really view that person like, hey, don't be an asshole. Like, come on, man. You could have just done something nice for me. Like, you're expecting me to, you know what I mean? It's these kinds of things.
Yeah, but I mean, it gets even more complicated because, of course, if the person pays you back, Peggy Clark has done a lot of research on the business of what, if you reciprocate, it changes the character of the relationship. It's no longer a caring relationship necessarily. It's sort of a brokered relationship.
Yeah.
And so that that can be kind of what you feel in that. If he feels the need to pay you back, and presumably it has to be a payment that's appropriate, not too high, not too low, all that kind of stuff. But that again changes the character of the relationship. And one thing we haven't talked about, and I know we're running out of time, but for me at least, there's the question of, okay, so if it's true, and this is always if and a big if it's true that empathic concern, as I've talked about it, evokes an altruistic motive, as I've talked about it, where does this come from? Why is this there? And I would argue that, and I don't know.
Okay,
that probably should be said up front, because I haven't done research on the origins of this, but my speculation is that it's a sort of extension out of parental care.
Yeah.
Because you think about, well, what's the evolutionary benefit of this motive? And evolutionary biologists have been very good about pointing out a lot of the problems with an altruistic motive, because the altruist should lose in the game against the egoists or the self-interested individuals in a sort of survival of the fittest kind of situation. But in mammalian species, where children are born unable to take care of themselves and survive, to have concern, other-oriented concern for that offspring, it's clear that there's survival value in that, and species that don't maintain that die out very quickly, mammalian species. Now, I mean, there are other ways, other strategies that species can use, like just having zillions of offspring can keep the gene pool going. But I tend to think that it's that generalization from parental care. And I don't think you have to be a parent to feel that. I mean, I think you don't have to be an adult to feel it. Kids, I think they care deeply for their stuffed toys.
Yeah.
And I think they have empathic concern for them and altruistic motives related to them. But I do think that that's probably where the sources, where it begins, and it's tapping into that, generalizing that is what's going on in what I'm talking about is the empathy-induced altruistic motive.
Yeah, there's been a lot of good research on this, over the past, 20, 30 years. This idea of cooperation, right, and interdependence, and how you can move from things such as kin selection and then parental care, and then you start bridging that outward in these types of surrogates.
I would see kin selection and what I'm talking about is parental nurturance as being quite different.
Sure, yeah. But in the bigger scope of things, though, in cooperation.
And I don't think cooperation is related either.
Oh, really? How do you see it different?
Cooperation is sort of coordination between equals to some degree. And I'm talking about, parental care obviously has a paternalistic quality to it.
Sure.
And I think, and there are downsides of that, obviously. And that's what leads to, a lot of resentment for attempts to care, like the thing I was talking about earlier with a kid who is not feeling the need the parent knows that he or she is feeling. So, we actually did did a study trying to go after this a bit, where the conditions, these are undergraduate participants, which
Sure.
that's who I work with because that's what's available.
Right.
And I do think they're entirely human. And so I think they're subject to the same psychological processes in this regard. So I'm not troubled about using it, but some people are troubled about me using it. So they had a chance, or they learned about someone in need, and the someone in need was either another student like themselves, college student, or it was either a puppy or an adult dog. And in each case, they had a broken leg, and they were in rehab for this broken leg. And so there was a scenario that they heard about this, the rehabilitation and the discomfort this individual was feeling. And from many people's point of view, one of the things that produces empathic concern is similarity.
Yep.
So from that standpoint, you should certainly feel more empathic concern for the student who is a peer of yours and like you, versus someone from another species. But from a parental nurturance standpoint, we assumed that they would actually feel more empathic concern for the dogs, which they did.
Interesting. That is super interesting. Wow. So you really are breaking this distinction down between cooperation as more in an equal playing field relative to like a paternal one or a parental one, excuse me.
Yeah.
And interesting. But you could be cooperative with people at different, it's not always
Oh,
cooperative.
no, it's not. But
Sure,
I'm just, when you, I think that the dynamics and the evolutionary origins of cooperation are different from the evolutionary origins for empathic concern and altruism. Because cooperation is, learning to hunt as a group and coordinate that and those kinds of things, which are, obviously very important.
Sure.
It's just, I think that's a different process.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Yeah, I've never heard it broken down that way. That's definitely something to think on. So I guess the last question here, what have you seen with the empathy, altruism, this whole kind of model? How have you? Obviously you've been a part of this research, but many people have done. You've mentioned some of them here. Have continued to do other types of research in this way. What kind of offshoots or branches have you seen that has been some good, interesting work off of this? And where do you kind of see this kind of evolving or developing? I guess for folks that are doing this research.
Well, the basic research, unfortunately, as I've said, and I would consider what we've done is pretty basic research, just trying to look at the relationship of certain emotion, motivation, connections, that sort of thing. I think that requires experiments with humans as participants, put in a situation where they encounter someone that either is in need or that they believe is in need, and so forth. And that means, well, either finding people in need, putting people in need, or using deception. And the current research milieu says don't do that. And don't do experiments either. A lot of it is we have dumbed down our research methods, I think, substantially. And to hark back to biblical things, we have sold what I think is our birthright for a mess of pottage. And so I don't know of anybody who's doing research
I mean, probably doesn't get funded. Does it pass IRB? Does it get funded? I mean,
Oh, you can. I mean, I got funded, but not without some effort. And you do. I mean, I appeared before IRBs and tried to explain how this was not the same as the Milgram study or something like that.
Right.
So I don't see research going on much. There are occasional examples, but that's the basic stuff. The applications, on the other hand, that's where things can and are moving ahead, and some of them are done with a research interest in it, and some are not. And unfortunately, one of the people who was doing most interesting stuff, I thought, was Emile Bruneau, and he died early. He was doing studies on conflict resolution in like Israeli Palestinians, in Ireland, lots of interesting areas, and doing some neuroscience-based research, but we lost him. And so, and there are some others, but again, I think right now, I hope, I would love for there to be more basic research, certainly, and I certainly think there needs to be. I don't think we closed the book on that. I think we just, the field sort of walked away from it because it became a bit too difficult to do, and it was easier to do big data research. These studies, for example, running each participant takes an hour. And of that hour, about 20 to 30 minutes of it is spent with the debriefing, where you're talking with them afterwards and making sure they feel all right. And so it's not easy, quick and dirty research. It's not the way you get a dissertation back.
This is certainly true.
But the applied programs obviously are not easy either. But there's things like the Roots of Empathy project, which is now international. It was started in Canada, and a really interesting technique that they use. I don't know whether you're familiar with this or heard of it, but
no.
This is Mary Gordon who started it, and the idea was to try to improve, to elicit empathy. Now, her definition of empathy tends to be more perspective-taking than I would like as a definition, but perspective-taking is certainly an important step toward empathic concern. And so what they did was with really young children, elementary school, sometimes even preschoolers they use, they, over 9 months, I guess, once a month, a parent from the neighborhood will bring his or her, it's usually her, but it could be a his or both, infant child, baby, into the classroom. And they put down a green sort of felt rug or something, and the students in the class circle the rug. They put the baby and the mother, the parent, in the center, and they watch the interaction and they talk to the mother. And so, in a sense, it's using, the thing I like about it is it's using parental care as the stimulus. And there has been research trying to check on the effects of this reduced aggression.
Interesting.
Some evidence of better cooperation. It's clearer on the reduced negative side of things.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a really kind of, in some sense, a novel experiment, but you're trying to capture it in kind of in vivo, that parental piece of it. It's very, very nice. Dan, this has been such a wonderful privilege to talk with you about this. This was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and a big thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.